So after replaying Assassin's Creed Syndicate in full earlier and making a near hour-long video on it, I figured I should make a follow-up for the Jack the Ripper DLC. Not only because many people speak highly of it, but also because, believe it or not, I've never played it. While I enjoy Syndicate, I just never really felt motivated to play its DLC that came out only shortly after the full game's release in December of 2015. But man, I'm really glad I finally got around to playing it. It tackles and solves so many of the issues I had with the main game, and of course, it's based around one of the biggest mysteries of the world, and one I'm personally interested in, with Jack the Ripper and his true identity. A real-life serial killer who was never caught, and over a century later, there are still tons of theories as to who he really was. And this DLC for Syndicate puts its own Assassin's Creed twist on these events. This DLC takes place 20 years after the events of Syndicate's main story in the year 1888 and in Whitechapel, the real-life time and place of these murders. And this DLC all but immediately solves probably my biggest issue with Syndicate's base game: the tone. In my Syndicate video, I made a large point that I felt the game's light, upbeat tone completely clashed with the setting it was set in, with 19th century Victorian London, because it was a very dark time period, and many elements of the game, whether it was the story, characters, soundtrack, I felt clashed with the tone that should come with this setting. But Jack the Ripper gets this right, and it was so refreshing. First things first, the soundtrack, which is just incredible, composed by Bear McCreary, one of the best video game composers of our time, so no shock there. It's got this very dark, mysterious tone to the music that I feel is much more befitting of the setting and story the DLC is trying to tell. It's almost got this mystery noir vibe to it, which is obviously befitting when you're tracking down one of the most infamous serial killers known to man. The world this DLC is set in, while it takes a chunk of Syndicate's open world, also does a phenomenal job of supporting this darker tone. That bright and vibrant color palette of the main game is replaced by a darker grayish look. There's snow falling, it's cold. You can even see the character's breath as you're just moving through the world. The world is smaller and more condensed, making parkour feel a bit more viable and eliminating the need for fast travel. The DLC also introduces new world activities and different types than what's present from the main game. One of my complaints with the base game was that the liberation activities didn't have a whole lot of variety to them. It was basically 3 different missions that repeated themselves in each borough. And while it was fun for a bit, it did get rather repetitive for me after several hours. This DLC, in its far shorter runtime, manages to have more unique and varied side missions. Whether it's killing Jack's lieutenants, a walk of shame, a brothel attack, the Ripper's letters, saving abducted women, fight clubs, or the carriage of justice. Although that one was terrible. You have to escort innocent people who are accused of being Jack the Ripper in a carriage, and you can't go too fast or you'll scare them, and you can't let the carriage take too much damage. But here's the thing, if you just move the carriage at normal speed, not even accelerating, that's going too fast. So it's just constant start and stop the whole way. You have to move slowly. It's so boring. I don't know why they designed it that way. But aside from that one mission type, I really enjoyed this DLC's side content. The quests were unique and the world felt denser. I rarely found myself needing to use a carriage to traverse, and instead relied on parkour and running through narrow alleys, which felt more engaging. Outside of Whitechapel, you also travel to some pretty unique environments and locations throughout the story, something you didn't really do much of in the base game, so I appreciated that change of scenery as well. There were numerous additions and changes to the gameplay. Now, you do play as Evie Fry for a large majority of this DLC. You don't actually get to play as Jacob at all, which I'll touch more on that when discussing the story, but you do get to play as Jack the Ripper Ripper, which was awesome. By far the best time I had with this DLC was getting to play as the Ripper. He is an assassin in this game, so he does play similarly to one, but there's still some key differences. First of all, the game actually allows you to assassinate anybody, even random civilians, although it does yell at you eventually for doing that. But still, I thought it was a neat touch, even though the real Jack the Ripper didn't just target anybody. You can perform brutal assassinations with the knife, which were very prolonged and brutal, as they should be when playing as Jack the Ripper. You can also do these as Evie, in which the animation doesn't look quite as gruesome, but I like that there's a difference between the Ripper and Evie's animations to show the different methods of the two characters. Whenever you're playing as him, you get these text pop-ups and strange screen effects. I suppose it displays to you the dark thoughts in his head, which I thought was a cool idea. But really the biggest thing this DLC introduces, in terms of gameplay anyways, is a fear system. You can perform numerous actions to scare enemies away in this game. It's a 3-stage system with calm, anxious, and frightened that'll have people running for their lives. You scare enemies by performing a brutal assassination in front of them, impaling someone with a spike, or using a fear bomb. In the case of good old Jack, you can scream to scare people away as well. It's a more brutal way of dealing with enemies than what we're typically used to in Assassin's Creed, and I loved it. I think more AC games should utilize a fear system like this. It gives you an entirely different way to approach things. It's also fun and satisfying to use, watching enemies run from fear. I hope they eventually bring something like this back in Assassin's Creed. The Rooks are not present in this DLC, and instead you can hire prostitutes to distract enemies, similar to how you could in the older AC games. The incredible black box missions from the base game are back, again with unique opportunities and creative assassinations, along with large and well thought out and designed sandboxes. The leveling system is made all but irrelevant, which is a huge win in my books, seeing as it was one of my biggest issues with the base game. The DLC starts you out at max level 10, and you can only go up to level 11, so no damage sponge enemies or having to worry about leveling up, so you can do enough damage, which is nice. This DLC really trims down some of the bloat of the base game, which includes the gear customizations and weapons as well. A much smaller progression system to go with it, with only a few skills. There may be too few options, but it's a DLC that's only a handful of hours long, so it does the job. There's a big emphasis on investigating murder scenes, as there should be in a Jack the Ripper DLC. It's especially interesting because most of the victims and locations are historically accurate, although minus the whole Creed angle. This DLC puts its own spin on Jack the Ripper, making him an assassin, and the prostitutes who were his victims being assassins that served Jacob's Brotherhood. It is a bit of an odd decision to make Jack the Ripper essentially a rogue assassin with this tie to Jacob. They could have just made him a mysterious serial killer that Jacob and Evie hunt down, and I think it may have landed better, but I was still interested by the story. And it's their own way of putting an Assassin's Creed related twist on this infamous mystery. I think trying to give Jack the Ripper motivations and a backstory was unnecessary. They could have kept it very vague and ambiguous, which I think is part of what makes him such a scary figure to begin with, because nobody really knows what his true motives were. There's so many different theories. That's part of the mystery and what makes him so terrifying. But instead, the story goes for this Anakin, Obi-Wan, apprentice betrays the master sort of trope story between Jack and Jacob. I wasn't a huge fan of that angle, but I thought the story was still engaging and mysterious enough to keep me playing. Like I said earlier, tonally much darker than the base game, which I was all for. And it was really rewarding to get to see these aged, more mature versions of Jacob and Evie, even if we only get to see Jacob for like 5 minutes at the beginning. In the base game, I felt there was too much Jacob and not enough Evie, and with this DLC, it's the opposite. It was all Evie, who I liked and was happy to see more of, but I really liked how different Jacob's character felt at the beginning. It really seemed like he had grown and matured a lot in those 20 years, and I would have liked to see more of this mentor detour version of him. Oh well. Most of the story is Evie hunting down the Ripper and trying to find Jacob, where we uncover more of the Ripper's past and that he was Jacob's apprentice. But then I guess his mom died and he blamed Jacob, so he started killing assassins. It's, again, the motives and backstory was just not necessary, but I do like that they at least never unmasked him, keeping the mystery of what Jack the Ripper looks like, well, a mystery. I also really liked his voice and the look of the character. I don't think he wore a bag over his head in real life, but he probably didn't sound this cool either, so...
Now, I will hunt you down.
And I will say, the final boss was way better than the base games with Steric, actually allowing you to use stealth and your different tools. It was kind of scary being chased by the Ripper as well. Ultimately, the story, it's not the best. It had so much potential that it didn't tap into, but it's serviceable, and I really like the change tonally from the main game, involving the setting and the characters. It felt more like Assassin's Creed to me, and as someone who is quite fascinated with the mystery of Jack the Ripper, I had a good time with it. It wasn't perfect, it had a lot of potential that it didn't fully live up to in my opinion, but overall, I thought it was a great DLC. The job of a DLC is to improve in areas the base game struggled, while delivering more of what people liked about it, and this DLC does just that. There were so many great improvements that I actually preferred it to the base game, which I can't say that about too many games, especially in the Assassin's Creed series. I'm glad I finally played it. A lot of you had been asking me to for a while now, but this is all just my opinion, of course. Feel free to let me know down in the comments what you thought of the Jack the Ripper DLC for Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. Special thank you to my members for supporting me, and other than that, thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day, Assassins.